Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. You know how much we love to explore these big questions, and today we're going somewhere that always sparks a lot of curiosity. The connection between quantum physics and Spiritism.
Oh, yeah. This is one of those topics that really gets people thinking.
Absolutely, and we've got some really interesting material to dig into. We're going to look at where these two worlds, these two ways of looking at reality, might actually sort of overlap, where they definitely go their separate ways, and what the scientific community has to say about all of it.
We know you guys love to really get a handle on these complex subjects, right?
Yeah, our goal is always to make sure you walk away feeling like you've grasped the core ideas, that you've had those aha moments without getting bogged down in too much jargon.
So we've really tried to boil down these sources to the essentials, the real meat of the matter.
Right to the good stuff. And the big question we're tackling today is, can quantum physics actually offer any kind of scientific validation for spiritist beliefs?
And as we'll see, the sources we've looked at approach this with a real mix of curiosity and caution, kind of keeping an open mind while also staying grounded in what we know.
Right, that balance is so key.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's dive in. One of the first places people tend to draw a connection is with this idea of like a non-material reality.
Okay. Yeah.
Quantum physics has revealed all this weirdness about how the universe works at the subatomic level. Particles, it turns out, don't really behave like tiny little marbles. They can actually exist in multiple states at once.
Right. It's wild.
It really is. I mean,
Mhm.
think about it. You have one particle existing in multiple possible realities, like simultaneously,
Right.
until we actually observe it or measure it.
It's like our everyday intuition about how things should work just completely breaks down.
It totally does. So doesn't this kind of echo the spiritist idea of a spiritual world, like a reality that exists beyond our physical senses?
That's where things get interesting. I mean, that initial spark, that intuitive connection, it makes sense. Quantum physics is showing us that reality is far, far stranger than we ever imagined, even within what we consider the physical world.
Right.
This concept of superposition, where particles are in this fuzzy, undefined state until we measure them, it definitely challenges this purely materialist view of the universe, the idea that everything is just solid matter bouncing around.
It does. It really does.
And it's natural for people to say, hey, wait a minute, maybe this lines up with what Spiritism has been saying all along about a non-physical spiritual realm.
Exactly.
But here's the thing, and it's a really crucial point. Quantum physics, at its heart, describes the behavior of matter and energy within our universe.
Yeah.
It doesn't automatically prove the existence of some separate, spiritual dimension. The strangeness, the mystery, it's all happening within what we already consider the physical.
That's a really important distinction, I think, for people to grasp. Now, another area where people often see a connection is this whole idea of consciousness and what's called the observer effect in quantum mechanics.
Yeah, that's a big one.
Huge. So it seems like the very act of observing a quantum system can actually change how it behaves. And this makes some people wonder if consciousness itself might have some role in shaping reality.
Right.
And this really resonates with the spiritist emphasis on thought and intention, right?
It does.
The power of the mind. You always hear people bring up the double slit experiment as the classic example here.
Right, the double slit experiment is fascinating, but it also often leads to some misconceptions.
Okay.
So the basic idea is we find light, or other quantum particles, through these two tiny slits. And what we see on the screen behind the slits depends on how we set up the experiment.
Right.
It's almost like these particles are deciding whether to act like waves, kind of spread out, or particles more localized based on how we're looking at them.
It's so weird.
It is weird. Now, the observer effect, what it really means is that the way we measure or interact with a quantum system, that can influence its behavior.
Got it.
And yes, some interpretations of quantum mechanics say, well, maybe consciousness itself is what causes this collapse. But the mainstream scientific view is more about the act of measurement itself, the physical interaction.
Right. So the observer doesn't have to be some conscious being pondering the mysteries of the universe. It could just be a detector.
Exactly, exactly. So while this idea of consciousness playing a role is super intriguing and aligns with certain spiritual ideas, the link in quantum physics, at least right now, is more about that physical interaction causing a system to take on a definite state.
Okay, so it's more about the physical act of measurement than some mystical mind over matter thing.
Right, exactly.
Got it. Okay, the last big point of contact that people bring up a lot is this idea of interconnectedness and what's called non-locality in quantum physics. And the best example of this is quantum entanglement.
Oh yeah, entanglement is wild.
Seriously wild. You have these two particles that are linked in such a way that they can influence each other instantaneously, no matter how far apart they are, like across the universe,
Yeah, it's
even.
mind-boggling, right?
It really is. It almost feels like science fiction.
Yeah, like something out of Star Trek.
Right. And so for some people, this feels like a scientific nod to the Spiritist idea of this deep interconnectedness between all beings, this kind of subtle energy network that permeates the universe.
It's a really powerful metaphor. I mean, the fact that these two particles can be so intimately linked across vast distances, it does kind of hint at a level of connection that goes beyond what classical physics would allow.
It really does.
But again, we have to be very precise here. Entanglement, as we understand it in quantum physics, is a well-defined phenomenon. It has its own math, its own rules, and it's been experimentally verified.
Right.
It's not just some vague idea. So while it might be a great way to think about broader spiritual concepts of interconnectedness, it doesn't, in its current scientific understanding, directly prove or explain those concepts.
Right, right. So there are these fascinating parallels, these echoes between these two very different ways of understanding reality. But the sources we looked at also make it very clear that there are some pretty big differences and areas of real controversy.
Definitely.
Yeah. And I think a good place to start is with methodology, like the fundamental ways in which quantum physics and Spiritism go about investigating the world.
That's a huge one.
Huge. So quantum physics, as we've touched on, is built on the scientific method.
The bedrock of modern science.
Exactly. Controlled experiments, rigorous data analysis, peer review. It's all about building knowledge based on observable evidence.
And that's where we run into a key difference with Spiritism. Spiritism often relies on methods like mediumship and communicating with spirits,
Right.
which, while deeply meaningful to those who practice them, haven't really gained acceptance within the scientific community as being scientifically valid.
And our sources really emphasize this point, that the scientific community just doesn't generally view these methods as meeting the criteria for scientific validity.
Yeah. The scientific method is all about objectivity, replicability, the ability to test and potentially disprove a hypothesis. With mediumship, there's a lot of subjectivity involved. The conditions aren't controlled in the same way, and it's very hard to replicate results consistently.
Just a different way of knowing.
Exactly. It's a different epistemology, a different way of understanding what constitutes knowledge and how we arrive at it.
Got it. And this difference in methodology is really at the heart of the skepticism that a lot of scientists feel when it comes to these claims of quantum physics validating Spiritism.
It's understandable, right?
It is, it is. And speaking of skepticism, our sources also spend a lot of time talking about the dangers of what they call unwarranted extrapolations. Taking an idea from one field and kind of shoehorning it into another without really solid evidence.
Right. It's like you said earlier, just because something has a quantum-sounding buzzword attached to it doesn't make it scientifically legitimate, and it certainly doesn't mean it aligns with Spiritist teachings either.
For sure. We see this a lot, where people will get really excited about some aspect of quantum physics and then make these huge leaps to say, see, this proves this about Spiritism.
And the sources call out some really specific examples of this, like trying to equate the perispirit, the semi-material body in Spiritism, with something like quantum vacuum fluctuations, or claiming that quantum physics somehow proves the existence of God.
Or even that negative space-time is like the spiritual world.
Right, exactly. These kinds of claims, they just don't hold up either scientifically or from a Spiritist perspective.
And it's not that people aren't asking interesting questions, it's just that we have to be really, really careful about making those kinds of leaps.
Rigor is everything.
Totally. And so, this kind of brings us to the broader issue of the general skepticism within the scientific community towards Spiritism.
Yeah, that skepticism is definitely there.
It is. And the sources suggest that this skepticism largely stems from the fact that, physics is primarily focused on studying the material world.
The physical universe, the things we can measure and quantify.
Exactly. While Spiritism deals with the spiritual realm, with things like consciousness, the afterlife, the soul.
Which by their very nature are much harder to pin down scientifically.
Totally. So a lot of scientists would say, look, these are two separate domains of inquiry. Trying to use quantum physics to prove or disprove Spiritism just doesn't make sense.
It's like using a hammer to try and fix a computer.
Right. It's the wrong tool for the job. Now, it's also important to note that even within Spiritism itself, there isn't one single unified view on this relationship with quantum physics.
Yeah, that's an important point. There's a lot of diversity of thought within the Spiritist community.
Totally. Some people do believe that quantum physics might offer new ways of understanding concepts that have always been kind of central to Spiritism, but were hard to grasp scientifically.
Right, like the non-material nature of reality or the influence of thought on the world around us.
Exactly. But others would say, no, no, science and Spiritism are distinct paths to understanding reality, and they should be treated as such.
Parallel paths, each with its own strengths and limitations.
Right. And our sources really emphasize this call for caution within the Spiritist community.
Yeah, a lot of emphasis on not getting ahead of ourselves.
Totally. There's a real warning against spreading ideas that link Spiritist phenomena to physics without having that solid scientific and doctrinal foundation.
It's like that old saying, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence.
Right, exactly. The sources even bring up Kardec's principle of doubt. The idea that in the absence of conclusive facts, we should maintain a healthy skepticism.
And they also quote Arasto, warning against accepting falsehoods no matter how tempting they might seem.
That's so important, that intellectual honesty.
Absolutely. So it's not enough to just find some superficial similarities between quantum concepts and Spiritist ideas.
Right, we have to be much more rigorous than that.
We need to really understand both the science and the doctrine before we start making connections.
For sure. And we have to be very clear about what's speculation and what's actually been proven.
Transparency is key.
Absolutely. So, with all that in mind, why do these quantum paradoxes, these mysteries, why do they capture our imagination so much?
Well, I think there's something about the strangeness of it all, the way it challenges our everyday understanding of reality that really resonates with people who are drawn to spiritual ideas.
Yeah, and our sources delve into some specific quantum phenomena that often get brought up in these conversations.
Okay.
So let's start with the quantum leap. This idea that a particle can seemingly vanish from one spot and reappear in another without actually traveling through the space in between.
It's like teleportation at the atomic level.
Right. And it's easy to see why someone might draw a parallel to Spiritist materialization, right?
It's a natural connection to make.
It is, but the sources are careful to point out that this comparison has some pretty big flaws.
Yeah, for starters, we're talking about phenomena happening at vastly different scales, right? The
Right.
subatomic world versus these macroscopic objects that we can see and touch.
Right, right.
And second, we still don't fully understand the mechanisms behind quantum leaps.
Okay.
So while it might look like disappearance and reappearance, it might not have anything to do with the processes involved in materialization, which we also don't fully understand.
So it's not a one-to-one comparison.
Not at all. And that's the key takeaway here. Even if things seem similar on the surface, we have to be really careful about assuming they're caused by the same underlying mechanisms.
Makes sense. Okay. What about wave-particle duality, this idea that quantum objects can act like both waves and particles?
Oh, yeah, that one's a mind bender.
It really is. It's like they're choosing how to behave based on how we're observing them.
And that's what makes it seem so subjective, right?
Right, like our consciousness is playing a role.
And that, of course, ties in with a lot of spiritual ideas about the power of intention and all that.
Absolutely. But again, the sources caution us to remember that the observer in physics doesn't necessarily have to be a conscious mind.
In most cases, it's really just any interaction that leads to a measurement.
Right, so it's not always about some mystical consciousness collapsing the wave function.
Yeah, exactly. Wave-particle duality is a real phenomenon, a fundamental aspect of quantum mechanics, but it doesn't inherently imply conscious choice in the spiritual sense.
Got it. And then we have wave function collapse, this idea that before we measure a quantum particle, it exists in all possible states at once.
Superposition.
Superposition, right. And then boom, when we measure it, it collapses into a single definite state.
It's one of the most counterintuitive aspects of quantum mechanics.
It really is.
Yeah.
And the observer seems to play a key role here too, right?
It does, and this has led to tons of different interpretations within physics.
Right.
Some of which do involve the observer in this kind of active role.
Okay.
But again, while this might feel connected to spiritual ideas about manifestation and consciousness, the scientific understanding is still evolving.
So we're not quite there yet in terms of connecting it directly to spiritual phenomena.
Not quite.
Okay. And then finally, we have non-locality, or quantum entanglement, which we talked about earlier.
The spooky action at a distance.
Right, that instantaneous connection between particles that can be separated by vast distances.
Mm.
And the sources point out that this also really challenges our classical notions of space and time.
Yeah, I mean, it suggests that there are connections and influences that operate outside of our usual understanding of how things work.
Absolutely.
Mm.
But again, entanglement is a specific physical phenomenon with its own rules.
It might be a great metaphor for interconnectedness in other domains, but it doesn't necessarily provide a scientific explanation for spiritual interconnectedness as it's understood in Spiritism.
Got it. Now, the sources also specifically critique this one idea that's been put forward by a quantum physicist named Amit Goswami.
Oh, yeah. Dr. Goswami's work is really interesting.
He's proposed what's called idealist philosophy, which suggests that there's this universal consciousness that underlies everything.
And he uses that idea to try and resolve some of these quantum paradoxes.
Exactly, like non-locality and wave function collapse. So this feels like a more serious, scientifically informed attempt to connect science and spirituality.
Right. It does. He's not just making some superficial comparison. He's actually trying to develop a model that integrates both perspectives.
Right. But the sources are critical of his model, suggesting that it doesn't quite align with core Spiritist beliefs.
And the main point of disagreement is this idea of individual consciousness, or the spirit, being independent of the physical body.
Right, that's fundamental to Spiritism.
It is. And Dr. Goswami's model, at least as the sources interpret it, doesn't really account for that in the same way.
So it's more of a one consciousness model.
Right, whereas Spiritism emphasizes individual spiritual beings that exist separately from the physical body.
It's like the difference between a vast ocean and individual waves.
A great analogy.
Now, I think it's helpful to kind of zoom out a bit and look at all of this from a historical perspective.
Okay.
Our sources provide this really insightful overview of how physics has developed over the centuries, from Aristotle to Newton to Einstein to quantum mechanics.
It's a fascinating journey.
It really is.
Yeah.
And it highlights how our understanding of the physical world has been in constant flux, always being shaped by new discoveries and new ways of thinking.
And the sources make this point that physics has historically been primarily focused on the material world.
Right. The measurable, the quantifiable.
Exactly, with the spiritual realm largely falling outside of its scope.
Although there have been some exceptions.
There have been some scientists who ventured into those areas.
For sure. But the dominant trend has been this focus on the material.
Which makes sense given the tools and methods that science has traditionally used.
Right. And the sources also talk about why the scientific method, while incredibly powerful for studying the physical world, just isn't really well suited for investigating spiritual phenomena in the way that Spiritism describes them.
Yeah, that's a key point. I mean, the scientific method relies on controlled experiments, replicability, being able to isolate variables.
Yeah.
And spiritual phenomena, especially as understood in Spiritism, you're dealing with intelligent beings, spirits, who have their own will and agency.
And whose actions aren't always predictable or controllable in the way that physical systems are.
Exactly. The source even quotes Kardec on this, saying that Spiritism is not in the realm of science.
Right. So even one of the founders of Spiritism recognized that these two domains of inquiry have different rules, different ways of approaching knowledge.
Yeah, I think that's crucial to keep in mind.
Absolutely. And unfortunately, the sources also remind us that the skepticism within the scientific community has been compounded by a history of fraud and misrepresentation in paranormal research.
That's a real issue, unfortunately. There have been some cases where people have deliberately faked phenomena or misrepresented their findings.
Right, and that kind of casts a shadow over the whole field.
It makes it much harder for legitimate research to be taken seriously.
It really does. So with all that in mind, what does the future hold for this intersection of quantum physics and Spiritism?
Well, our sources are pretty clear that, as of right now, there's no definitive scientific evidence that establishes a direct connection between the two.
Right. We haven't found that smoking gun yet.
Not yet. But they do offer some really thought-provoking ideas about how things might develop.
Okay.
They suggest that maybe the physical and spiritual planes aren't as completely separate as we tend to think.
Okay.
That they might even be different aspects of the same underlying reality.
So maybe there's a deeper connection there that we just haven't fully grasped yet.
Maybe. And they also point out that phenomena like physical mediumship, which involve observable effects in the physical world, will eventually need to be explained by the laws of physics.
Right. If they're real, then they have to operate within the laws of the universe.
Exactly. So this implies that our understanding of physics might need to expand in the future to accommodate these kinds of phenomena.
That's exciting to think about.
It is. And the source ends with this really interesting idea, suggesting that as humanity evolves morally and ethically, science itself might become more spiritualized.
Okay, what does that mean?
Well, they're suggesting that maybe in the future, science will be less bound by a purely materialistic worldview and more open to exploring the complexities of consciousness and interconnectedness.
So maybe a more holistic approach to science.
Right. And they even reference Kardec's prediction that science would eventually come to accept the truths of Spiritism.
Wow, that's a bold prediction.
It is. But it reflects this idea that our understanding of the universe is constantly evolving.
And who knows what the future holds, right?
Exactly. So to sum it all up for you, our listener, while there are some truly fascinating parallels between certain concepts in quantum physics and Spiritism, it's crucial to remember that these are two different fields with different ways of operating.
Right, they're approaching the world from different angles.
Exactly. And the scientific community remains largely skeptical of claims that quantum physics proves Spiritism.
They're saying, show me the evidence, the hard data.
Exactly. And even within Spiritism, there's a strong emphasis on caution and rigor.
Don't just jump on the bandwagon.
Think critically, examine the evidence, and don't make claims that you can't back up.
So with all that said, our final thought for you today is this.
Okay.
If we take seriously this idea that our understanding of the universe is still evolving, that both science and spirituality have their limitations, but also their unique strengths, what might a truly integrated understanding of reality look like?
How do we bring these two ways of knowing together in a way that honors both of them?
What might the future of knowledge hold if we're open to exploring all possibilities with an open mind, but also a critical eye?
That's the challenge, isn't it?
It is, and it's one that we hope you'll continue to explore with us.
Thanks for joining us for another deep dive.
We'll see you next time.
Guys, see you in another podcast. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel.